Thanks everyone for joining. The webinar that we'll be discussing today is Designing for All and looking at how to approach accessibility and universal design in the digital and physical world for a better experience. My name is Keith Diamond. I'm a director and head of social impact at Symplicit. And we also have Matt Grove and Aaron Buescher presenting today, and Beth will also be online moderating the chats for any questions that will come through. We're all colleagues at Symplicit, which is a human-centered design agency that has been around since 2003, and we've been working in many sectors, from government to transport to education to finance, for not-for-profit, working in those realms of delivering strategic design, customer experience, product design, and digital implementation using our human-centered design approach. Basic overview of the webinar is we'll give a presentation, and hopefully at the end of our time together, we'll be able to have a Q&A. So feel free to put questions in the chat along the way. We'll just be able to see the chat. The questions won't go to everyone, but we'll be looking at the questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get to those questions at the end of our time, towards the end of this hour with you. But before we make a jump into the topic at hand, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We acknowledge their continuing connections to land, place, water, and community. And we pay our respects to elders past and present and recognize their strength, diversity, resilience, and deep connections to country. My colleagues and I acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar from the lands of both the Gadigal and Meanjin people, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are today. So back to this poll. If you're just joining us again, I've asked people to answer a quick question using that QR code that you see on the screen, or there's a link in the chat that you can use. But essentially what we're asking is, when discussing product and service development in your field, what terms do you use to encompass designing for diverse user needs and capabilities? And as you can see, that there's quite a few different terms that people use interchangeably, and there's quite a broad spectrum of ways that people use them. I encourage the person who's put the something else, I'd be curious for you to post that in the chat and say what that is. But we're looking at terms like accessibility, inclusive design, universal design, accessible design, just design, or human-centered design. And there's that something else, which I'd be interested to see what that is. But looking at this graph, do you think that this multiplicity impacts design? And another question is, do you think that even within different industries and professions, they use different ways to define these terms? Well, I'll let you ponder a little bit on those questions, and we'll get to that shortly, and that's an important issue that we'll discuss. But I think we can have an entire series on the evolution of all those different terms and the nuances between them. And unfortunately, I think that's going to be for another time. For the purposes of this webinar, I'd like to bring all those terms under a unifying goal of what we're calling designing for all. And I borrowed a definition from Purser's research from the Institute for Humane Technology in Sweden, which says that designing for all accessibility is the extent to which products, systems, services, environments, and facilities are able to be used by a population with the widest range of characteristics and capabilities to achieve a specified goal in a specified context. Now, I do want to say that there's a disclaimer here that I will use these different terms like universal design and accessible design interchangeably, so you might hear these different terms throughout, but what we're referring to is this designing for all. So I imagine everyone present is interested in how to achieve this goal in our own fields. But there are challenges in defining what is not accessible, inclusive, universal in one field, let alone getting professionals across fields and industries to fully align on what designing for all actually needs to be. This is also a challenge laid out by Persons and his research team who offered that definition in the previous slide, but essentially creating seamlessly cross-channel experiences that fully embrace designing for all becomes problematic as we try to fit all those pieces of dynamic, inclusive, accessible service experiences together as all stakeholders. As you can see on the slide, you could be talking about architecture, web, human factors, the policy that envelops these projects, the human resources, the healthcare that's involved with the customers that use the products that we're talking about, coming together, and all people on this project understand what we mean by designing for all. There's also another term that I just want to stop and talk a little bit about is cross-channel or multi-channel experiences. And what I mean by this is where the digital, architectural, the print, the performative dimensions, they're all part of this service or product experience, which also can exist in different geographies and locales as well. And I think that most services these days we experience have some sort of cross-channel facet of experience. So to illustrate my point and the challenge at hand, I want to just run by this short anecdote with you. So imagine Sarah. She struggles with visual impairment. She's signing up to become a new member at your company on a beautifully designed, accessible website. But when she received her membership information in the mail, the type is too small and she struggles to read any of the content. That accessible experience she enjoyed before was not integrated through that entire experience. And that could be likely because there were two different teams working on the digital and on the print parts of this customer journey. So this lack of collaboration and alignment in universal design when creating these dynamic experience, I'll refer to as what I'm calling siloed design. And what I mean by siloed design is where teams are working away. They may be extremely well at what are doing extremely well at what they do within their own domains, but all the parts do not add up to the intended inclusive goal. So in the context of accessible or inclusive design, if it's done piecemeal, you may risk the entire experience toppling over because that interaction and journey between customer touchpoints was not holistically considered. That one accessible touchpoint, as was in the case with Sarah, could create a domino effect that ultimately renders the entire service inaccessible to her. So there's also this other meaning ambiguity that I want to introduce that creates challenges in our goal for designing for all. And that's determining who and who is not impaired and under what context. And I do want to be clear here, my intention is not to downgrade the serious challenges people have with disabilities that greatly impair their daily lives. I want to acknowledge these, but I do want to take a moment and reflect on this slide statement. How do you decide who is and who is not impaired? And does this definition create a bias in the way you approach accessible or universal design? I mean, is impairment always and forever? I want you to think about some of these examples as you also think about those questions that I just posed. For example, someone like Sarah, who is permanently visually impaired, might struggle every day. But then what about someone who's gotten a little bit too much to drink and among other impairments, they might struggle with visual impairment depending on how much they've been drinking. Or how about that tennis player who rolled their ankle? Yesterday they were sliding around the court, but today they struggle getting around. And we've all been that person at some point in our lives where we're commuting to work with our headphones on or looking down at our mobile phone. I mean, wouldn't we be temporarily hearing impaired or visually impaired in those circumstances? And how easy is it really to get around a pram in a city? And finally, would there be some level of impairment when we are dealing with a headache? So what bias I'm challenging here is another form of siloed design, where we put people challenged with a long-term disability or impairment in one category, and then everyone else is in another. And this design mindset often leads to thinking of accessibility as an edge case or just different, rather than thinking of accessibility as pervasive to some degree for everyone in everyday life. Might I propose we think about people's capabilities and impairments along a spectrum instead? And within this spectrum, these qualities change based on the context of their personal, environmental, and social spheres. So I raised a few challenges when designing for all, but what about those opportunities? There is innovation potential in embracing a designing for all mentality. Many of you know the product OXO Good Grips product line, their award-winning line of kitchen tools. And they've changed how consumers think about kitchenware design. You can see how they've transformed the everyday peeler, which is actually now in the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, for being such an innovative design. But essentially, the story goes that Sam, the founder of OXO, was in southern France on a vacation, and he was watching his wife Betsy struggle with her arthritis and peeling vegetables while she was cooking. And it dawned on him to make a product. And so Sam collaborated with Smart Design to make an accessible product for all. And that vision and that mindset was central to that widespread success and how people now view the sort of ergonomics of kitchenware design. So then you may ask, okay, so how do we address these pitfalls of trying to achieve universal design excellence, or in other words, avoid what I'm referring to as siloed design, namely those broken customer experiences across channels or treating accessibility as an edge case? And how do we unleash the potential of universal design? The remainder of our time together, I'd like to share with you some of our experience that may help you think about tackling these questions. Now, while this webinar is not explicitly about HCD or human-centered design, I do want to highlight how HCD, human-centered design, is integral to addressing those previous questions. As I mentioned before, Symplicit apply human-centered design to just about any problem space, whether it be in business strategy or product design. We're always striving to make impactful products and services. And we do this using human-centered design to dig deep and investigate why people have particular needs and do the things they do. And we're looking for that deep meaning, that motivation, and those values behind everyday life. So to preface, human-centered design is this special ingredient that has put us in the right frame of mind to learn from lived experience and to create inclusive solutions. I assume that many people listening are quite familiar with the HCD process, but to boil it down for everyone, human-centered design starts with a challenge or a goal, and through a process of expanding and collecting those diverse experiences and perspectives from customers and other stakeholders and subject matter experts, we take all these experiences and empathetically formulate solutions that have real value to the people those decisions will impact. So essentially, human-centered design essentially leverages our diverse experiences to drive decisions, and this puts us in an inclusive mindset. So we'll share with you 3 projects which utilized HCD and also touch on different channels of experiences and an approach to designing for all. I'll first share with you my experience with transport ticketing systems. Matt will share his experience with digital inclusive design. And then Erin will share her experience with designing Sydney train stations. So I'd like to share with you an example where taking the designing for all mindset fostered innovation in strategic service delivery. The OXO Good Grips is a great product example in innovation, but I want to share with you something a little bit more strategic that involves multiple channels and show you that by taking this design for all mindset does also create innovation. So we had worked with a client that was aiming to reimagine how people use ticketing for public transport. And they were also trying to ensure that their ticketing network would be inclusive, safe, and sustainable. So we worked with them to answer a core question. How do their ticketing systems impact public transport passengers? So we embarked on a research program, which included sort of lived experience interviews, intercepts, ethnographic studies, as well as quantitative surveys. And we tried to look and include people from a diverse representative cross-section of the population. And to do this, we used a lot of specialty recruiting channels to make sure we were getting that representative cross-section of passengers that represented diverse backgrounds, abilities, and also locations. But the nature of this project and how it was commissioned set us up to deliver artifacts in a way where it was assumed that disadvantaged passenger personas would be different to the general population personas. And in effect, we were going to deliver two sets of personas to illustrate the general population and the disadvantaged population. And by following this siloed way of thinking that two groups were wholly different would have probably yielded standard results. But what we decided to do, and we were aware of this assumed dichotomy could be inhibiting value, is that we start to reflect on all the stories holistically, and that this was regardless of being a disadvantage or not. And we saw similar stories of ticketing use challenges and common ways people adapted and used the systems across the spectrum. And we began to plot these stories from the most resilient passengers to the most vulnerable, and a strategic framework began to emerge. That framework was looking at how ticketing options, that's the way that people purchased and used them, influenced mobility resilience. And what I mean by mobility resilience is the ability to continue to easily move around regardless of your current context. The interesting thing was with this framework was that not all the people challenged with disability were vulnerable, and not all the everyday passengers were resilient. It had much to do about their life context and the ticketing options available to them. And so this framework gave our client a unifying concept that provided a way to think about all passengers' needs inclusively along a spectrum, and strategic direction on how a service as ubiquitous in our lives as ticketing could foster a more inclusive and resilient community. So in summary, the project started out with that sort of siloed trajectory in thinking, but in the end, taking a design for all mindset, delivered an inclusive strategic framework that accounted for everyone from the most vulnerable to the most resilient, and is applicable to all the channel experiences involved in purchasing and using tickets. So that was my story that I'd like to talk about in my experience. Now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Matt to talk a little bit about inclusive design.
Thank you, Keith, and good afternoon to everyone on the call. Here we go. So I want to explore the question, what do you think, or what do you do when you think you've done everything right, but your design still doesn't work? This was the case with a client of ours we worked with a few years ago. They provided or designed and developed a platform, an online platform that allowed users to plead guilty online in the instance they had been charged with a minor offense. This means they could sit at home while the magistrate reviewed their case, and they would receive their sentencing in the mail. It was meant to declutter the court system. The client told us only a very small percentage of users who started the flow ended up finishing it. And we wanted to understand why. So we did some testing. We gathered two groups of people. The first group, we spoke to people within the legal industry to understand what they think of the flow. And the second group of people were people who fit the demographics of people who had previously completed the flow. We wanted real users to test with. And very quickly, we started to see some things. Now, these are real quotes from real people. If a person doesn't have an understanding of legal terms, they could find this confusing. Now, if you got a ticket, would you automatically be made aware you can plead guilty online? Do people even know this exists? This is awful. It needs to be clearer about what happens after the court date. This is enough explanation. How much detail do I need to give? There's no explanation about what the court or magistrate wants to know. There's too much information here. People will not read this. So it became obvious very quickly that the client did not test with real users before build. Essentially, the platform was not inclusive. So what did testing tell us? We gathered some insights from the testing and we pulled out 4 big ones. So there was excessive legal jargon used across the platform. People did not understand this. The landing page created excessive cognitive load due to the vast amount of new information being presented at once. There was a lot to take in. There were no clear explanations regarding what happens if you do plead guilty. Do I go to jail? Do I get a fine? What happens? And there was a lack of awareness when it came to the next steps. So we asked ourselves, how can we use inclusive design to solve these problems? Before I tell you how we did that, I want to introduce inclusive design in the instance you're not familiar with it. So it's a set of methodologies used to create products that cater to people of all backgrounds and abilities. So regardless of accessibility or age or geographic location and language, it means putting people first. And a really nice example of this is the ability to change a language on a website. If someone is using a website and English is not their first language, the ability to change that language is an example of inclusive design. The design is inclusive. And there are these nice principles that fall under inclusive design. I like to get mine from inclusivedesignprinciples.org. There's a lot of research to back up why these are good. The first one is providing a comparable experience. So ensure your interface provides a comparable experience so all people can accomplish the same task. Consider the situation. So people could be first-time users. They might be using a website when they're stressed. They might have a baby in one hand. Consider the situation when you're designing. Be consistent is number 3. So use familiar conventions and apply them consistently. Give control, number 4. Ensure people are in control. They should be able to access and interact with content in their preferred way. 5 is offer choice. So provide different ways to complete tasks. A nice example of this is when you swipe to delete a message on your iPhone. If you don't know how to swipe, you can click select and choose a message and push delete. There's choice there. Prioritizing content, so help users focus on the core tasks within the platform, and also adding value. So consider the value of features and how they improve the experience for different users. Does it really have to be there? So the first thing we focused on was the big issue, which was legal jargon used across the platform. We wanted to change this. So we decided to remove the complex sentence and rewrite them. We rewrote every sentence on the site to a reading level of 1 to 2, which is equivalent of grade 7 English. And it turns out 44% of adults in Australia read at this level. Now, the client wasn't originally, that they didn't like this initially. They thought we were dumbing down the language. But another study from the Nielsen Norman Group disproved this, and we found that even professionals want clear, concise information devoid of unnecessary jargon or complex terms. They want to be told what needs to be done to the point quickly and succinctly. And this change made a huge difference. I've got an example here of how we made this change. So if you see point 1, this was a paragraph in the original design. The title says offender levy. What on earth is that? The first sentence, if you're given a sentence in the magistrate's court, whether or not a conviction is recorded and whether or not you're there in person on the day, you're liable for payment of the offender levy. It doesn't tell you how much the payment is. It doesn't tell you what the offender levy is or what it's for, and it's generally complex. Now, if you look at the new design, point 2, costs associated with your plea of guilt. The user knows there will be a cost associated. Point 3, we list the cost, $125.80. And point 4, we tell the user what the offender levy is. It helps cover the costs of running the legal system. The sentences are short and concise, and they tell you what you need to know. The second thing we did was focused on providing explanatory prompts across the platform. People didn't know what they had to write, how much information was enough, what things were. I have another example here. So the original design, point 1, what date are you required to attend? Attend what? Point 2, the date of the hearing is listed on your notice. What notice? Now, if you look at our new design, we've added a title, the details of hearing. Point 4, what date are you required to attend your court hearing? So we tell them what date are you it is simpler. We have explanatory text. So this is the date of the hearing listed on your notice to appear. And we've added further information that adds value. So you must submit your guilty plea at least 2 business days before your court date. Point 5, we upgraded the UI to a pattern with evidence behind it. And point 6, we also included a where to find this button. So clicking on this exposed an image of that notice appear with the court date highlighted. We provided a clear view of the whole process. So initially the flow was 4 pages long, and the second page was a form field with 15 questions on that page. Now we broke that up into 5 different sections: details of hearing, details of offense, supporting information. You can see on point 1, we added that left-hand bar that shows you where you are. And point 2, it tells you your step 3 of 5, so you know how long you have left. It doesn't bombard you with a million form fields either. It's only relevant to details of your offense. We did a few other things too. We built in the ability to change the language of the platform, improve the UI for users with mobility issues by increasing the clickable area on components. We built in error prevention to ensure the form was complete before the user clicked the continue button. And we created a really thorough confirmation process that gave the user a sense of security when the form was submitted. They knew what was happening after they clicked that submit button. Something I like to do as well is benchmark. So we benchmarked the original design and the new design as well. We use something called the UEQ, the User Experience Questionnaire, and this asks participants to rate 26 items on a 7-stage scale. And it's really thorough. The graph you're about to see is performed against benchmark data from 18,500 individual people from 401 different studies. Now you can see here the graph is broken up into 7 sections: attractiveness, clarity, efficiency, dependability, stimulation, and novelty. And all you need to know here is red means bad and green means good. And this is how the original website ranked. It didn't do too well. We're all in the red or the orange. Now, after we redesigned, we tested again, and we got a substantial increase. Attractiveness, clarity, efficiency, and dependability all increased dramatically. Stimulation and novelty, not so much, but they're not important when it comes to a website when you're just completing a form. So I'm almost done, but I do want to leave you with a piece of advice that's important to me and I'd like to share with you. You are not your users. Design with people in mind. And when I say people, I mean everyone. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Erin, who will talk to you about accessibility in physical spaces. Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name's Erin. So earlier today, we've heard from Keith and Matt about pitfalls of separating accessibility requirements from a core project. I'm going to talk to you a bit about what it can look like when accessibility is just a normal part of a project and it's all built in. While Keith and Matt touched on digital solutions, as Keith mentioned in the intro, I'm going to be referring to projects in the built environment or physical spaces. So what I mean when I'm talking about this is large infrastructure projects. So think about public transport, airports, or large services that need to accommodate a lot of people every day. These types of projects carry with them a unique complexity. The range of stakeholders that are involved in this is broad because a lot of them are formed under consortiums, which means a lot of different businesses are involved, each with their own subject matter experts. So you might think, well, in that case, this should be easy. Big infrastructure means a lot of money. Big budget means you can do anything you like, so you'll be able to get things right. Hopefully that should be the case, but unfortunately it isn't always. So, have you ever found yourself in a position like this? Think about when you've been out and about. Have you found yourself feeling a bit lost in a new city or a new station? Have you found it hard getting through a ticketing gate when you've got a bit too much to carry, or getting through train doors quickly enough when you've got a lot of luggage? Or have you been injured and found it a bit challenging to get through spaces which are usually a breeze? Some of these sound maybe a little bit more like an inconvenience rather than dealing with accessibility. But what if that wasn't just from time to time? So when you consider something like a public transport network and the amount of people who walk through it each day, it sort of masses up to a lot of people experiencing this on a day-to-day basis. And as Keith mentioned earlier, ability certainly isn't binary and it's not always visible. When looking at inclusive or universal design principles, a really great resource is Microsoft. They've created a really simple way to look at it, as your ability can be impacted in many ways across your life, whether that's situational, carrying a lot of luggage, carrying instruments, pushing a pram, temporary, like a broken arm, a broken leg, rolled ankle, or permanent, like blindness or being in a wheelchair. It's a really good way to consider it. And after all, designing for all of these people on the right will capture the mobility needs of the people on the left. For one of our clients, Sydney Metro, they classify all these people collectively as people with restricted mobility. And this opens the door for inclusive thinking, as their mindset is already in the right place to understand that there's a variety of circumstances where people's mobility might be diminished. In the case of Sydney Metro, the need to get this right is particularly important. They're also changing their service model. So the normal paradigm at the moment on a train is that when people need some help, they're able to find a person at the ticketing gates or the platform. The Metro, though, will be predominantly automated with less human intervention, meaning that the design needs to work, and it needs to work really well for all of these people to be successful. So how do you start off when you're looking at inclusive design? Where should you begin? Well, a lot of the time it will begin with your recruitment. So if you want to be inclusive, it needs to mean that you're going to have an inclusive set of people. How often have you seen or completed a recruitment spec which is purely based on demographic dimensions? You might have your gender, your age range, and maybe a little bit about experience, like they have or haven't used this, or they're a super user, or that sort of thing. Maybe sometimes you add a little bit of extra dimension because you think you're being a little bit more inclusive. You're considering language or the level of education. There's absolutely no doubt that demographics play an important role in providing indicative snapshots of a user group. But what are other ways that you could maybe look at adding dimensions to your recruitment so you can be a little bit more inclusive in the way that you speak to people and the people that you include in your research? One method that we've used, which has been really effective, is to take advantage of those assets that you create as human-centered designers, mapping out personas, or if you don't have personas, high and low needs, different attitudes or behaviours across a matrix, and they can be used as something to recruit to. So you can use surveys to align different attitudes and behaviours and needs, and then, of course, still layer in your demographics, your ability, and other traits that will be laid in there. But it's a really simple way to get a diverse cross-section of people into your research and make sure you've kind of got a broad spectrum of needs covered. Some other really useful resources that you can look to for this is, like I mentioned, Microsoft's Inclusive Design website, and also the University of Cambridge has a really handy online calculator, which is interesting. Even if you want to have a play, you can have a look at who you're excluding and what the impact of that exclusion looks like. So once you've got all of your recruitment lined up, when you're talking about physical spaces, what does testing look like? So digital prototypes can be quite a simple thing to do. You've got Figma or similar software, you whack up some wireframes and you can really effectively test and save costs before building. It's a fantastic way to understand how people might use your product. But what if you're using a physical space and it looks like this? It's a bunch of rubble with machines. A lot of the time when we're testing, we definitely ask our research participants to do a lot. We ask them to ignore low fidelity, imagine this button worked a different way, or some placeholder text says something a little bit more meaningful or informative for them. But it's a little bit more of a stretch to ask people to imagine a set of escalators, a walkway, some lighting, access point platforms. I'm sure you can understand that stretching the imagination this far with people and getting meaningful feedback don't go hand in hand. And also for your clients, updating code on a website is just a little bit less dramatic than getting them to knock down a wall or change a full surface of a station. So what are some of your options? Definitely this isn't an exhaustive list, and I will also add that a really great way to gather some initial research is to do in-depth interviews or contextual inquiry. That'll get you a long way to understand the needs and behaviours of your customers as they exist today. But on the testing side, there are a few different options. We can do cognitive walkthroughs. That's largely done with floor plans. It's about as lo-fi as it's going to get. You can do observations and intercepts. You can do physical prototypes. Definitely not suggesting that you prototype a whole station here. I'm talking about smaller elements. And then, of course, there's the power of virtual reality. So I've included sort of two sections of options here where I've titled as a designer or a project team versus with participants. And the reason why I've included that is that some of these other ones, like your cognitive walkthroughs, they're a really good way as a design team to start to get an understanding for the possible problems that might exist within a design, which can then become hypotheses that you can use to evaluate when you're testing with participants. And this also, going from left to right, is a bit of an investment spectrum as well. So obviously the cost of doing a cognitive walkthrough is about as much as your time and a piece of paper, versus setting up a virtual reality, both getting the 3D environment set up and, of course, the hardware is a bit more of an investment. Some of the things that we've managed to capture using a variety of these methods have been things like changing locations of lifts within a station, which obviously would be a real challenge to change in post-build. Wayfinding or signage inclusions, including wording, location of the signs and size of the signs, rest spaces and dwell zones, station furniture, positioning of elements within universal toilets like baby change tables and sink heights, lighting, and one of the most surprising that we've come through with is actually changing a station name. So it might sound like if you've got all your recruitment lined up well and you've got the assets and the budget to run testing that you won't have any issues, but unfortunately that's not the real world. All projects will have issues, and some of them that will come up when you're trying to design inclusively within the physical environment are things like awareness and willingness to invest. So that might not be your client, it might also be that diverse, broader range of stakeholders. Of course, the practicality of timeline and budgets. Access to your design participants. Sometimes it's not so easy to use an external database and ask for these certain dimensions of people. And then stakeholders and standards. So that's something I'm just going to touch on a little bit more, because this is something that Matt covered, where he was given a website that was fully AAA tested, but still wasn't usable. So standards cover mainly a lot of the big ticket items, like having ramp access, wide enough doorways and halls, handrails, accessible toilets, parking spaces, and the list goes on. But what the codes won't tell you about is the reality of their implementation and how they can fall short or even miss the mark entirely. When we speak to people about their experiences within spaces, in particularly about mobility or accessibility, we hear time and time again about how they can be let down. So some of the most common fails we hear about are things like finding accessible toilets locked, Braille implemented incorrectly by not having a tactile surface, lifts not in service, customer service desks being above eye height, and the list goes on and on and on. So sometimes these suggestions of improvements then are taken with a bit of a challenge, because a stakeholder might feel that they've met the standard requirement and their job is done. And it's then your choice and your job to challenge those standards. They might be a bit hesitant to change something, especially when they don't see the benefit of it. This is where your role, though, as a designer becomes really, really important. Collaborating effectively with these people at different phases of the project, where your research insights will have the most ability to make a real impact to everyday experiences of people in their lives. It's up to you then to be able to translate what you've heard and tell a story and build empathy and show the reasons for that improvement. It's also where the most important and effective collaboration can happen. So where you play the role as a designer, you become the advocate to clarify and express the needs of customers, and then collectively you can find solutions that make that beautiful Venn diagram overlay where you've got that sweet spot between customer needs, feasibility, and viability. Collaborating early can also shortcut some of these issues from even happening. A great way to collaborate can be to include your stakeholders in some of your research activities. They definitely don't need to be taken along for the entire research program, and not a lot of people have the time or budget to do that. But when it is an option, getting stakeholders or SMEs to come along on this can really help for you to build trust with your stakeholders and therefore get you a voice at the table and create empathy between stakeholders and customers. So just like Keith spoke about, a channel shouldn't be considered in isolation. You need to step back and look at the whole journey. In the same way, design teams shouldn't exist within a bubble. They need to collaborate with their stakeholders, Connect yourself early with broader teams, include diverse thinking, and leverage the expertise of these stakeholders. That way, you'll be able to push the design from meeting a requirement to exceeding expectations. Most often, the solution to complexity and constraints will be able to be found through collaboration and that diversity of expertise and thoughts which those people can bring to the table. After all, it's not about saying these standards are no good or an us versus them mentality that can sometimes arise in projects. It's about questioning how they can be better so the experience is improved for everybody who uses it. Thanks a lot, Keith.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks, Matt, for sharing your experience. So I'd like to do a little bit of a recap now because I know that we've covered quite a bit. We started looking at the multiplicity of designing for all and how designing for only within our silo can create broken channel, cross-channel experiences. We have also looked at the caveats and viewing people with long-term impairments to be different from others and trying to define like what is impairment and what's not. We've also touched on that innovation potential for taking the designing for all mindset. Then we've shared a few of our learnings for designing for all, along with some of those techniques that we use in the human-centered design process. And I feel like it has been a lot of ground that we've covered. So I'd like to leave you with some of these takeaways, which sort of follow along with those stories that you heard today and that you see on the slide. The first one is to be aware of the siloed design thinking that may inhibit you from seeing that bigger, more inclusive, innovative potential. Are you thinking that accessibility is an edge case or different to what might be experienced in everyday life? Because you might be missing out on some of those innovative opportunities. Two is you're not your users and speak with your users then. So no matter how knowledgeable you are on the topic, you still may not be thinking about the experience in the same way that they live it. And then number three is to collaborate across the entire project team and to foster that universal design. Inclusivity is not just about our users. It's about how we work in a team and then how do we integrate across the teams as well in those cross-channel experiences. What I'd like to do is now pause and open it up to potentially some questions or comments that we'd like to share. You could put your comments in the channel. We can see what you write, and then we can look at what we have time to respond to. But also, we're really interested in your feedback. We'd love to know what you thought of this presentation. So you could use the QR code that is on the screen there to jump over to our feedback form and provide some feedback. Okay, so I think the first thing that I just wanted to see here is that there were a few comments about the beginning about those different terms that we used at the beginning: accessible design, universal design, inclusive design, and someone put down something else, and I believe that something else was neurodiversity in design, which I love that term, and I think that neurodiversity is certainly something to be aware of. And then there was also a comment around designing for all, it being something it's a good way to encompass all the customer needs, and I certainly agree that designing for all seems to say what it is rather than going into the semantics of these different terms.
The next question, Keith, I think
yeah.
was for me from Carmine, and it says, thanks for sharing the process to make the legal process more inclusive. Did the client take it on board? The client decided to take it on board incrementally, meaning they didn't implement the changes all at once. They broke it down and they have implemented some things, and some things we're yet to see. So that's what's going on with them.
Thanks, Matt. And I hope that answered your question, Carmine. There is also a short housekeeping question around, will this recording be shared? Yes, we have an intention to eventually upload this recording and share it. So if you're part of the LinkedIn community, we'll certainly be sharing a link when that becomes available. So hop on LinkedIn if you haven't put yourself down as an attendee there, and you can keep updated to updates for this event. There's also a question here around how difficult is it to get the sponsors to really consider people with restricted abilities and design for them in an inclusive manner. So to get business justifications, especially in situations where greater than 80% may not be restricted. I'll start off with this answer or a response, and Matt, maybe, and Aaron, you could jump in. But I would probably be talking to your sponsors about the value in testing with those. I don't want to say that they're extreme cases, but they are those more extreme cases of impairment that might occur with your project, and that those are solving for those contextual or those impairments that might be happening, as we talked earlier, where there might be someone, and I don't know the context of the project that you're speaking to, but if there's somebody that is temporarily impaired, you're solving for those issues that might occur in everyday life by looking at those people that are dealing with impairment, in the everyday of their life. So I would be having discussions and talking about that to your sponsors and showing that those values are catching those impairments that you might not be able to be catching with those everyday users that you have. Not sure if Matt or Aaron, you wanted to add on to that sort of response, but I'll hand it over to you guys if you have.
Good answer, Keith. I agree with you.
All right, we've got another question coming through here. How do you draw the line or decide which groups don't need to be included for a certain project? Interesting question. We're sort of flipping it on the side there about who not to include. I'd say short answer is you don't want to exclude anyone if the chance is there. I do realize that resources and budgets and timelines don't often allow for that sort of comprehensive look at users, but I would say that try to get the spectrum. So try to find out where that spectrum of users are, and then try to grab a cross section of that spectrum of capability and impairment that we were speaking about. So try to look for those extremes, because in those extremes, you're most likely going to be solving for the middle users.
I think I'll add to that, Keith, as well. It's a little bit like what I was referring to about creating sort of a matrix view of when you're recruiting. So when you think about personas, like, I hope that nobody has a persona called Accessible Andy, because it's not a thing. It doesn't exist. That person doesn't have needs that are different to somebody else. So I suppose by creating that matrix of sort of more needs and behaviors and making sure you're sort of touching across that, you might actually be able to, rather than thinking about, oh my gosh, my recruitment needs is suddenly multiplying out to 35 people. We don't have the time or budget to do that much testing. We have the time or budget to do much fewer. So by sort of looking at it in what is the actual core need that you're trying to solve for, that can be a way to really sort of draw that line on who is included in your research and why that needs to be there. It can also be a bit of a justification for those people who are finding it a bit challenging with stakeholders to justify, like, why do we need to include this group of people when it represents a tiny smidgen of what we think our audience is. Well, that's sort of going back to that sort of binary thinking of this person is or isn't impaired or able. And so by looking at it rather than in that way, you can look on needs and behaviors, and you should get a much higher coverage of that spectrum by doing it that way.
Thanks, Erin. So I think we're getting to the end of the time with our talk today. So I really want to send a great big thank you for everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're really passionate about this topic, and it sounds like there's a lot of people that are very passionate about this topic too. Feel free to reach out with any further questions. You can see the email there, hello@Symplicit. Say hello and ask us anything further if you have. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope you have a great day and go forth and hopefully we can design better for all. Thank you.